Hey everybody, Blaise here, and I'm really excited to let you guys know that I've got my good friend Woody Woodman here. Woody and I used to work at Disney together. We go way back, 25 years, I think. And in our ongoing quest to continually expand all of our content at Creature Art Teacher, we asked Woody, who is an amazing storyboard artist, to come on over and teach a course in storyboarding. Woody's got experience all over the world, all over the industry, and he's got a really great approach to storyboarding and storytelling. And so we thought, man, it would be nice to get him in. And so, Woody, do you want to talk a little bit about your course and
Sure.
what you were doing?
Thanks, Aaron.
Yeah.
Anyway, it's a pleasure for me to work with Aaron again on something like this. And he asked me to do the course, and I thought, well, you already have a few courses. What am I going to do that you haven't already covered? So obviously, I just thought about what I would want to learn and how I would teach this. And I've taught this to several story artists over the years that have gone on to be very good story artists. So
Yeah.
I started with the basics. A lot of times people will struggle with just drawing the character. So that's the first thing. We started with the basics and then move into sequential storytelling. So how do you pose a character? How do you tell a story with just the characters? Then you put the character in the environment, right? So if it's in the environment, then we can think about composition, cinematography. So we cover all those basic foundations in the first 4 videos. Then I put the story artists in a different sequence because in the industry you'll have some things will be slapstick comedy, other ones will be maybe more dramatic. Sometimes there's a conversation and you got to shoot something and you got to think about staging in an interior to make it interesting, to make it fun.
Yeah.
And then we get into a scary sort of chase scene. So these are different kinds of sequences that a storyboard artist would be asked to do.
Yeah, that's one of the things I love with your approach to this course is just the way you break things down, the way you are methodical, and the way you think about your approach to your shots, and which I think is really great. You know, we've got several courses on our website already on storyboarding, and so, but what I really want to do more of, and I think the students really benefit from, is to learn various subjects from the viewpoints of different people. And Woody brings a really great viewpoint to the way he storyboards as well. So I just think it really rounds out that content that we have.
Every artist learns differently anyway.
Yeah.
So I'm sure the method that I use is just the way it worked for me.
Yeah.
And so I just think that that's the way I approach when I'm teaching story artists. I say, hey, break it down, write the beats first, then work out the staging and the thumbnails before you start boarding. I know artists that don't do that. They go straight from script and they start boarding in a straight ahead approach, and that's the way they do. That's the way they do it.
But anyway, like I said, we're really happy to have Woody, and so go on over to creatureartteacher.com and check out the course. It's really great. And in the meantime, I hope you enjoy this sneak peek. And why don't you go out and put some beauty back in the world, and we'll talk to you next time. Thanks.
Sounds good. Hello and welcome back to the Drawing Board. I'm Woody Woodman and thank you for purchasing my storyboard course. I've been in the animation industry for 26 years and I started at Disney working on big pictures like Mulan and Tarzan and The Emperor's New Groove and Lilo and Stitch, and I worked my way up into the story department. I worked on Treasure Planet, Brother Bear, and then later I went on to do other feature films with Lucas on Strange Magic. I got to travel overseas. I worked in England with Aardman. We did Arthur Christmas. And over the years, I got to work with a lot of really great storytellers and really great artists. And believe me, every production that I ever worked on, I got a chance to learn something. Right? Every sequence that you work on, you get to learn something. Right? So as I started in my career, I moved from that animation department into the story department, and then I worked my way up into a leadership position as a senior story artist and a mentor. So now I got to train a lot of the junior artists. Then I moved into the director's seat. Now as a director, I got to direct over 300 episodes on Oddbods and Antics and some of these other animation series. And I kept teaching and training the story department. And I learned a lot over the years. So this course, I want to share some of that with you. I'm going to help you work smarter, not harder. I'll give you some tips about drawing, how to basically start your sequence, where to work, and what you're working towards, right? Every sequence has a goal, right? You're there to entertain the audience. So let's get started and have some fun. In this course, we're going to be covering a lot of basic stuff for storyboarding, and we'll slowly get more advanced, okay? I have two questions. What makes a good storyboard panel? And then what makes a good storyboard sequence? So here's some examples that you can look at. A storyboard is telling the story. It conveys an idea or an emotion clearly in a visual way. The emotion, the acting has to be in the boards. It has to be, when you look at a good storyboard panel or a sequence, it has to be very clear without any explanation. And in a good design. So you'll see that even though it's loose and rough, the basic characters in that panel or the action is very clear in this silhouette. There's going to be a range of emotions in the acting. The storyboards are really the key frames that then later on will sort of outline the sequence for the animators. And you'll have to draw from your imagination. You will not have time to basically get photo reference for every pose you'll need, okay? So you're going to have to be very familiar with drawing these characters and drawing the human figure in any angle that you might need for your sequence. This is an underwater sequence. They're fighting some kind of giant octopus. It could be a very dramatic scene, so you have to understand your cinematography and lighting and so on to create that mood when you're looking at the panels, the drama that's got to be captured in those storyboards. And comedy as well. So this requires an understanding of cinematography and film language, okay? So we'll cover that, of course, in the course. So these are emotional moments in the boards that has to be captured. You're going to capture that emotion. This poor guy, Sage, he's sort of drying out. He's not going to make it. Daisy's trying to help him. She's pushing him up the hill. But he's going to basically expire. So there's that touching moment between the two characters as he slowly sags down. Everybody reacts. So you're capturing that emotion in the panels and in the editing. And there goes Sage. This is from Timbo. He's stretching out to reach a little beetle. And of course, in the performance. So you got to be very aware of the characters and the performance and the anatomy. So he reaches, it cracks, it starts to wobble around. And you just get all that wonderful emotion in the boards. And there's a sweet moment with him and his mother where he finally gets the beetle. He lures him and then, This is another sequence from Timbo, but this elephant's having a little conversation with his trunk. He has sort of a split personality. And he decides to charge the wall, but he accidentally, he hits his own trunk. And this is like a squash and stretch kind of moment, right? So you get to get that gag. You got to understand basic animation principles as well. This is from Planet Sheen. He's sort of standing there and on top of this creature's head, and she's not happy about being woken up early. And this is where you can get the extreme comedy in some of these TV series where the whole castle will pop up and drop. So it's knowing how far to push that comic gag. So to do this well, it takes time, okay? You can't rush this. And you really want to learn it step by step, and you want to learn it well so you can perform at the level you need to perform, to work in this industry. Everyone, when they start drawing, every kid, myself, everyone, they draw like this. The world, when they look at a piece of paper, is very flat and very limited. So notice how the characters are always facing front. The grass is always at the bottom. The sun is always in the corner. And the student is always going to start in the middle, and they just work out until they fill the page, okay? And everybody starts out this way. Here's another example. The sun is in the corner. The characters are always walking on that horizon line. Everything's presented very flat, okay? Again, another example. Everything's flattened out. No kid, when they're starting out, they don't really understand perspective. It has to be taught. It has to be learned as they start to develop, right? As you develop as an artist. Another example of a road with no perspective. Most kids just start in the middle somewhere. They draw until they fill the page. The character on the right is standing on the page. The other one on the left is just, they started at the head and they drew down until they ran out of paper. That's very common, and everybody starts out this way. This is a drawing I did when I was 8 years old. Before the internet, we had a library, so we used to go to the library. And these dinosaurs were from a library book. So they're not bad. I was able to copy what I'm looking at, and that's how kids learn, right? They just kind of look and they copy. And after a while, you get pretty good at copying. Notice the background, though. All the background was made up from my imagination, okay? I'm not copying from reference. Here's another example where the student is basically drawing the head, then they draw the shirt, then they'll draw the arm, then they'll draw the pants, then they'll draw the boots. So they're drawing it in little puzzle pieces, okay? They're not really constructing the figure first and then putting the clothes on later. This is something you learn later in your development. This is a drawing I did when I was 12. Again, by this time, I could look and copy from something I'm looking at. So Conan looks about the same as John Buscema's Conan. But I didn't understand anatomy. I didn't really understand, I couldn't draw this character in multiple poses on model. I couldn't do that. Okay, I'm just copying, from something else, another two-dimensional surface. This is another student, just doesn't understand perspective, okay? So they just have trouble drawing a stool. It's kind of floating. It's a little wonky. They just need more basic foundation before they can really successfully storyboard. Now later in college, they start having you draw from real life, which is the first time. Most kids don't draw from observation. So once you go to college, they start having you draw still lifes, you start drawing from life, and this is really important. But at that time, I was rewarded because I would render. I would spend a lot of time rendering the subject. But really, I still needed to learn a lot more about composition, okay, which comes in time. Learning basic forms, learning about space, learning how to arrange these things, okay? That's what needs to happen first. And start with these basic objects, okay? Organic objects. Here's where you're developing a contour line. How to describe details and features with that line, okay? So when you're drawing these kind of organic objects like the bananas and grapes, you're training that contour line, which we're going to talk about. Okay, these are just more examples of basic foundation, drawing hats, clothing, how to construct the figure and then place the clothing around the figure. Then you start learning to draw from the human figure, okay? These quick gesture drawings, drawing from an actual model. You can see the drawings on the left are a little bit flat, right? The student is still trying to figure out the anatomy. And the drawings on the right, obviously I'm able to draw through and construct the figure with a little bit better perspective. So these kind of drawings, they're quick, but you're learning about anatomy, proportions, drawing from life. So these are very important. You can't skip this development, okay? Learning about shape, really pushing shape, learning about design. This is a turnaround, but you're drawing the subject from multiple angles, okay? And really I'm using tone to really improve my design in each of the drawings, okay? This is just more drawing from actors in costumes, trying to capture a story. If you can capture the story in the sketch, that's where you're going. For storyboarding, it's a very, very important thing to do, to be able to capture an emotion or the acting in a sketch. This is just more drawing from your sketchbooks, right? Draw everything from the cars to the trees to the houses to the people in those places. And then, of course, animals, right? Which they don't sit still very often, right? The animals. So you have to kind of study the anatomy. Then you go out and draw from life, and it becomes a very, it becomes a habit, but it develops those basic core skills that you need as an artist. Okay. Learning basic drawing and design. What is design? Because that definition is different from person to person, but the way that I understand it is this, okay? It's a visual language, just like any other language, but this is a visual language. As an artist, we are using this visual language to achieve a particular goal. Right? You're trying to tell a story, or you're trying to convey an idea through this visual language, okay? Composition is how you take those principles and elements of design and how you arrange them. That's what I was talking about when you're drawing from life and you actually arrange these things. You're composing, just like a composer would compose music, okay? So the principles, I consider them laws or rules, okay? They don't change, okay? Those are laws and rules of the visual language, such as contrast and proportions, okay? Elements of design are the tools that we use, okay? Those are the tools as an artist, okay? Line, shape, tone, space, lighting, repetition, and color. Those are our tools that we work with. The way that I may look at this different, you may talk to another artist and they'll explain things a little differently, but this is what made sense to me, okay? I looked at my basic laws of contrast, allowing to be able basically to see something with contrast. Then proportions. Anytime I'm drawing anything, I have to be aware of the proportions in that subject. The elements are those tools: line, shape, tone, lighting, space, repetition, and color. But then on that third column, that's the effect you want. Okay? So if you understand, if you're working on something white and you make a black line, you're using contrast. If you repeat the line, you might get pattern. Pattern is the effect that you want. So that column over there with pattern, rhythm, mood, emotion, emphasis, harmony, texture, and in a sense balance, because ultimately when we're looking at an image, it should be balanced, okay? If the subject is placed in the right place, if it's framed correctly, that's something that we want to achieve, a focal point or have balance in the composition. So that's the way I think about design, and that's what, during the course, we're going to be using this language. So I want to make sure you guys are aware of how I'm looking at design and how I use design in the storyboard process, okay? So here's an example, right? This is from Treasure Planet when Silver comes downstairs and he's going to berate the crew. You know, they got in trouble, right? So I want you to look at these panels and we're going to break down some of those things in design that I just talked about. So if you look at the image, you can look at it in terms of its linear, okay? How was the frame divided using line and also shape, okay? If you see the foreground characters and you see Silver silhouetted in that doorway, those are the positive shapes in the image, in orange. Then in yellow, I've indicated sort of that background or the space between or around the subject. We call that negative space or negative shapes, okay? Very important when you're doing an image to be able to see those two things. The silhouette of your main subject and the spaces and the shapes around the subject. Okay? Foreground areas. Smaller shapes within the bigger shape. You see the other pirates in the room. That background wall around Silver, which frames Silver. And these little shapes. Big, middle, and little. You always have to have variety in your design. There's Silver back there. So now we get to another shot. This is a close-up of Silver. Take a look at people get confused between lighting and tone. Lighting is how the light is affecting that area or the subject. So you can see that he's backlit, and there's a light that comes from behind him and putting his face and the room in shadow. Tone is assigning tone to anything in that image, okay? That's using your grayscale from white to the grays to the dark, okay? So that's how you're using tone in your design or your lighting. But they're two different things, two different tools. Space, if you look at the actual space, there's two things. There's the depth in the image, but there's also the size of the image. If you look at the size of the subject relative to the frame, this is a pretty wide shot. If you look at the depth, it has some depth, it has some perspective. You can see that. The wall sort of limits, the depth will cut off there. Now you put in those foreground pirates. Again, I'm using tone to separate the background, the foreground, and the middle ground. I'm using different tone. Now this one is an interesting shot where you have a back shot, but look at the lighting condition. The light's coming in from above through this sort of grate on top of the deck above him. So that's a lighting condition. You see how the lines are repeated? That's that repetition in that pattern over his head. And then this is how we're using contrast. By using the light and the shadow coming from above, you can push the contrast higher or lower depending on the mood that you want. Here's a close-up of Silver, and he's really angry. But notice what we do with our basic elements of design. We could add color, which creates emphasis on the eye. We could increase the contrast in that light and shadow. We can increase it and make it darker or lighter. We could use color and color the entire panel to increase that emotion or mood in the panel. Okay? So that's how we're using the basic principles and the elements to sort of push the emotion or whatever we're trying to create in that sequence. Here's another example, a much wider shot. So look at the initial lines that you might sketch. You're going to basically divide that frame in your composition. Then we start to add the main subject. We put some smaller little astronauts in there. Adding more detail, look at how the line is organized, okay? Larger lines in the foreground, the lines get smaller as they go back in space, okay? Then we can add tone. So now you can see I put tone on the whole panel. We can increase that contrast in the foreground. Notice even the repetition of the flowers. We have larger flowers in the foreground, and they get smaller as they get to the middle ground, and they disappear in the background. I'm adding a little more light and shadow. Now we put the highlights. This is going to create emphasis in the image. The ship and the astronauts are going to pop. They're going to pop because of that contrast, okay? I'm adding color just to tell you exactly what size the shot is. You can see the size of that ship relative to the frame. It's small. The astronauts are very small. So we know that that's a very wide space. And I can use the color in the panel if I need to really see something quickly. That's the focal point. I could increase the contrast in the lighting and create a more dramatic light and shadow by punching it up. But depending on my situation or depending on that sequence, you may not want that high contrast. You may decide to have less contrast, okay? So here, I've taken out that high contrast because of the mood. It depends on the situation and the context of that shot in the sequence. Okay. So design is a visual language used in illustration and storyboarding. So you need to really learn that visual language and get those foundations first, and then you're going to have a better time when you're storyboarding. Okay? This is what we're going to be covering in this course. Okay? There's going to be 12 lessons, and then each lesson will focus on one particular area of storyboarding. Starting with number 1, we're going to be working on drawing the key poses, okay? Putting the character into any particular pose, trying to create some emotion through body language. We're going to be paying close attention to anatomy and proportions and the drawing structure, right? How to construct a figure. Number 2, sequential storyboarding without a frame. We're only going to focus on storytelling, finding key poses in a sequence that tells a story. We're not going to worry about putting those characters in a setting or in a frame yet. Number 3, composition. So this is where we're going to be really looking at space, looking at arranging the subject in a frame, okay? So this is where you start learning your cinematography, okay? Number 4, we're going to concentrate on cinematography. So all of the shots, shot selection, camera movement, the characters, how the characters move in and out of the frame. This is the basic foundation of any kind of filmmaking or videos, animation. You need to have that basic film language of cinematography. Number 5, how to beatboard a story. Beatboards is a different kind of storyboarding, okay? But this is the one lesson that we will be talking about some elements of storytelling and character development. This course is not Obviously, we could teach a whole course on just storytelling and story structure, but this lesson, I'll be showing how to tell a story with those key moments of the story, okay? Beat boarding. Number 6, this is going to be a sequence on staging a conversation. So when you have to set up the camera inside an interior and have a conversation between two characters that are having some kind of debate or something. Number 7, we're going to be setting up a gag. So this is in one shot with very limited camera movement, but you're going to be basically setting up a gag in one shot. Number 8, we're going to be staging for a mechanical gag. So you're going to be using a prop, and we're going to be talking about how to set up a mechanical gag. These have no dialogue. Number 9, building a sequence around a particular set or location. Okay, the entire situation is based on a prop on one location. Okay, so it's interesting how to set that up, how to stage for that kind of sequence. Number 10, how to reveal a character in a unique and interesting way. So a lot of times in a film or in a movie, you'll be having to introduce characters into a scene or into the movie. Make sure it's an interesting way, right? Meet the character in an interesting way. Number 11, working in a montage. So a montage is a very different kind of sequence, usually driven by music. It's much more abstract. You're telling a story through a series of images and music and movement. And finally, number 12, we're going to put it all together in an action sequence. So you'll be focusing on editing and action to get drama and suspense. So that's what we're going to be covering in the course. We'll take it step by step. You must crawl before you can walk, and then walk before you can run. And that'll wrap it up for us. So let's get started. Hello, and welcome back to the drawing board. I'm Woody Woodman, and today is going to be lesson 4 of the Storyboard video course. And we're going to be talking about cinematography, okay? Cinematography. The learning objectives are as follows. One is we're going to be identifying shot selection that we'll be working with. We've already started to introduce that in the composition lesson. Second, of course, is framing and composition. So again, everything that we've started learning in the previous lesson, we're going to build on, okay? As we start putting characters, human characters or animal characters in a scene. How the subject will enter and exit the frame. A lot of people don't think about that. We're going to explain the 180. I mentioned the 180 in the last lesson, but I didn't go into detail. So we'll go into detail on that rule of the 180. How to work around the 180, because this will be a problem that we want to be able to use our different techniques, cinematography techniques, to work around that dilemma. We'll be covering camera movements, the different movements we have to work with, and continuity and screen direction. So when you're watching a sequence, you can follow the geography. You understand where people are. It's very easy to follow, okay? We're telling a story with a series of pictures or camera movements. We call this film language, okay? Cinematography is a language in itself. Film is a language. So we have to kind of cover these basic rules and things we have, the shots that we have to work with in this cinematography before we start coming up with amazing sequences, right? First up, shot selection. So the size of the subject relative to the frame. That's what determines how wide or how close the shot is. And I know what you're thinking. I have my cell phone. It's always the same size. What are you talking about? Well, we're going to look at it carefully here. You'll know what I mean. We're going to start with what's called the extreme wide shot, okay? In an extreme wide shot, I want you to at least, and they also, usually in an extreme wide shot, we call that an establishing shot. Where are we? Are we in the future? Are we in the past? Are we in the desert? Are we in whatever? This is going to tell you where you are, and sometimes it'll tell you when, based on the architecture or whatever. But look at the size. Look at the size of the subject. In this case, the subject is this palace or this castle or kingdom somewhere in the middle of the forest. You can see that there are larger birds in the foreground, and then they get really, really small as they get closer to the palace. That's going to give you scale. So you get a sense that this is really a big place, but look at how much space around the subject. Okay, that's the sky, that's the forest. That space is what's letting you know what size shot it is. Okay, in a wide establishing shot like this, you won't see any people that you recognize. If you see people, they're usually little bitty dots, little bitty people in cars in the city. Okay, that's called a wide or extreme wide establishing shot. Okay, and you can get really wide. You can be like outside of the earth. And so you're telling the audience, we're outside in space, and the earth is very small in that space. It's a wide establishing shot, okay? Now this is a little bit closer, isn't it? This is considered a wide, and you can see the in color here. The people, all the little people that we're looking down on. This is some kind of interior space where they have some kind of god or deity, where they're gonna have some kind of wizard or some kind of witch or some kind of priestess. She's gonna do a ceremony or whatever. So it's a wide space, but what determines that space is the size of the subject. In this case, those little people down there, that's the subject. All the other white space around is that negative space, okay? And it's very wide because the people are small, okay? Sometimes you can start with a shot like this, which is establishing that we are inside a palace somewhere, but you're starting inside the interior. I still can't tell who any of these people are. I can't recognize the actor and say, oh, that's, Keanu Reeves or something. You can't identify any of these characters in this wide shot. So it could still be an establishing shot. It's just not an extreme wide, okay? It's determined by the size of the subject to the frame. Okay. Here's an upshot. We're kind of looking up at this priestess with this deity behind her, and we can see a group of people in the foreground. So you get some sense of perspective, but this is still a wide shot, okay? Because you got to look at the subject, which are these foreground characters, and the main character who's doing some kind of chanting or ceremony. Look at all the white space around the subject. So it's still a wide shot. Okay, there's a lot of space to allow for that subject, whatever that mood or whatever that the story point you need to make. This is still a wide shot because of the space. Okay, so this is also a wide shot. But now we're dealing with a foreground character. So this priestess, she's here in the foreground, and then the other characters, anytime you have more than 3 people, you can just call it a group. Okay, so this is just a group shot of the 4 main characters, and then it's surrounded by all the other minions and soldiers that are not nearly as important to the shot. So you can look at the main subject. We are looking at those 4 characters, okay? Look at how much space is around them. We're clearly in a wide shot. Now, the foreground character, she's being cut off, right, somewhere around her waist. So we would call that a middle. But if you look at the subject of the shot, the subject is not the back of her head. The subject is the gang of 4 people, okay? That's really the subject. So that's why we would call this a wide shot. This is still considered a wide shot, even though there's a foreground character. Okay, this is a different point of view, right? Now we're still dealing with a group of 4 people, so that's called a group, but it's a pretty wide shot. If you look at the amount of space around the subject, you're going to know that that is a wide shot. I also wanted to mention it's staged flat, because the characters, if they're lined up on one line, moving like horizontally or up the hill like this, it's staged fairly flat, okay? It's a flat staging. So we'll be talking about when you're in your staging and thumbnailing, when you're staging for flat, and when you're staging for something that's more dramatic or has more depth. I also want to mention framing. Okay, so now we can use the foreground trees, the roof, there's some pots and all kinds of stuff growing in the foreground, and with tone or lighting, we can create a darker value. And look at how we can frame these characters as they go, walking up the hill. This is a little different. Now, this kind of staging has greater depth because the characters are small in the background and they're moving on what's called a Z-axis, okay? They're walking from the back and towards the camera, or sometimes the characters are walking into the shot in the foreground, very large, and they're walking and getting smaller. So when we're walking in perspective like that, coming in or away from the camera, it's going to have greater depth. It's just the way that it's been staged. It's the way the camera is looking at the subject, okay? So we call that the Z-axis. But you can see the depth. You can see the path they're walking towards the camera or away, okay? Now, this shot's interesting because the characters are being cropped, their body's being cropped off, but depending on the action, if you look at this guy is doing some kind of magic trick and he's juggling these balls of fire. The action of juggling, you need to allow for more space above the characters' heads for that action. So you always got to think about what your character's doing. If your character's hand is waving or if there's something above his head, you got to frame for that action. You don't want to cut that off, right? Cut the character off by the hand. You have to allow for more space. That's why this is still considered a wide shot, okay? It has to do with the context of what the character's doing, okay? See, you can look at the space, that negative space around the character. There is just much more space needed for the action, okay? This is another situation where if a character's he's being eaten or he's tangled up in the vines, he's going to be acting and moving around. So his body is full. It's inside the frame, but depending on the action, you're going to need a little more space around the character so the action is not too tight to the frame, okay? I told you in the last lesson about composition, be very aware of where the character is relative to the frame. Okay, so when you look at a character and he's going to be doing an action, struggling with the vines, you've got to allow for a little more space. So this is still considered a wide shot. Okay, so this is another example like we saw earlier with where we had the girl in the foreground. If you look at the character in the foreground, he's being cropped off at the legs. But if you look at the subject of the shot, he set some kind of village on fire here. Again, it's got to, you're going to feel that space around the foreground character. He's in a wide shot. We need more space for that action, okay? I also wanted to mention in the composition, we talked about thirds, I think a little bit in the last lesson. So where you place the character, you might want that character dead center and split the frame equally, but you may not. So this is another rule of thirds that we use in composition. Just knowing exactly if we place the character on a third, there's a counterbalance on the left and the right. Okay, so it's just a way to make the scene less symmetrical and knowing when to offset sometimes your subject. Okay, so that's a wide shot as well. Okay, this is something about framing. Okay, so here where the subject is the pig, right? And he's sort of being surrounded by the buffalo and the farmer and the professor. But let's just talk about framing. Now, we're still, just like we did with the teapot exercise, we want to be aware of those shapes. So in this case, if you follow the dots, right, you can go across the characters and it creates a triangle. So we're framing that subject, okay? A different option of framing. You got the character is in a full, which we haven't really talked about, but that's a full. His full body's in the shot. But look at, again, we talked about that tension last time with the foreground elements on the teacup and the teapot exercise. Same thing here with your characters. Okay, it's another triangle. That could be a triangle. That could be more like a column where you're composing in a square, right? But if it's a lighter moment, then again, I might circle the character. We're looking down now and look at the composition, see? We're framing in a circle. Circles are a little bit lighter, a little bit fun, right? Not as dramatic as a triangle, for example. Okay, let's talk about the next size shot here. We talked about the extreme wides. We talked a little bit about the wides and some of the differences in the wides. Now, we want to talk about the full, right? So now the characters, their full body from head to toe is in the frame. But there's a couple things that I want you to be aware of, okay? In yellow, I've just filled in so you can see the silhouette. You can see this. There's a little space at the bottom of the feet, between the feet and the frame. There's a little space between the head and the frame. Okay, don't do this. A lot of times you're not paying attention to how much space is between the head and the frame or the feet and the frame. You don't want your characters like this walking on the frame. You don't want their heads touching. That's going to create that tangent, that visual tension, right? So don't do this. See, it's too tight. You got to let the character breathe a little bit. Okay? That's the term we'll use. And let the characters breathe. They're running out of air, see? They're too tight. Let it breathe a little bit, okay? Now this is a middle shot, okay? It's middle because you're cropping some of the character off, you know, somewhere at the legs or the thigh or the shin. There's different places that we should crop. There's other places we do not want to crop. I also want to mention that when you have a two shot, we call this a two shot because there's two characters in the shot. It's from the side and it's fairly flat. So depending on the context of your scene, you may want to shoot it flat. If it's comedy, if it's lighter, if you want to have some light performance out of the characters, then stage it flat. If you want something more dramatic, then we'll pick a different angle that has more depth. It's more dramatic, okay? So here the hero, he's got his head partly cropped, so I won't have his head touching the frame, but you can cut it off a little bit, right? Cut him off at the forehead. You just don't want to cut some character off at the neck or at the waist, at the knees, at the joints. See, she's being cut off at the thighs. He's being cut off at the thigh. This is another two shot, but you're shooting from behind the female and you're focusing on the man, okay? So it's going to be a little more dramatic than a two shot that's flat, you see? You just have these options. Depending on what you're trying to say at that moment on that shot, then you'll determine. In this little lecture that I'm covering in this lesson, it's just be aware of what shots you have available. You can pick and choose. That's when it starts to get creative, okay? Here's a don't, okay? So now notice where we're cropping her head off. Literally, the frame is cutting her off at the shoulders and the head, okay? So that's going to be very uncomfortable. It's going to be very awkward. Creates a lot of tension that you may not need or want. Now I just adjust the camera, pull him back. Now you can cut her head off in half. That's fine. It's going to feel a little better. You just give a little more space around the character, okay? This is good. We're cropping him off at the thigh. He's sort of in his hero Superman pose. That's fine. And we put him on the third. See that? The column is over there kind of on the other third, and he's standing on a third. You know, so he's going to be what they call bias. He's going to be a little bit to the left, and then maybe on the next cut, the female might be on the right. We'll talk about that screen direction in a little bit. Now it's cropped a little different. You see, now he's a little more to center. His head is touching the frame, and we've cut him off at the knees. There is a difference. See? This one is going to feel better, stronger. the graphic design of the shot. This one, not. So this is something you just have to be aware of. And when you start watching movies, if it's a very good movie that's been very nicely designed, you're going to see great shots that are really well composed. And then if you see in a movie that doesn't have the same attention to detail, you'll see shots like this, where characters are cropped badly, creating tension when there shouldn't be any tension. All right. This is another don't. Don't crop a character off like at his waist, okay? Or on the belt, okay? It doesn't feel right. I don't know if you can tell the difference, but there is a difference between that, which is a well-balanced, strong design, good shapes, and then poorly composed. Poorly composed, okay? There is a difference. I'm just going to point it out, help you out. Okay, this is also in the middle. Like when we're talking about middle shots, it's called the over the shoulder, or OTS, okay? Notice the man is on the left and the female is over his shoulder. So his head and shoulder is framing with the frame on the left. So we're kind of getting a nice close-up on the female here, but you're not actually in a close-up. So this over the shoulder is a very common technique and a very common shot that we'll see that will be used when two people are having a conversation, right? And then we have the reverse, okay? So the reverse, we're still keeping that man on the left and the female on the right, okay? So this is what I mean by continuity, okay? The characters are still relatively in the same place on the screen. Take another look. See where the man is? He's sort of on the third, on the left. The female is on the third, on the right. When we cut, he's now the subject. We're seeing his face over her shoulder, okay? That means the continuity is consistent. It's the same, okay? It's just that we're simply looking at the female and then we're looking on the reverse, which is also an over the shoulder, okay? This is still called an over the shoulder, but usually when you're hearing writers and directors talk, they're just going to say, cut to the OTC, and then they'll just, and then the reverse, they'll basically be using some dialogue there from over the shoulder and then the reverse. Okay, now I just want to be very specific on composition, okay? So the term I've heard used is good puzzle pieces. That means they're very different shapes from cut to cut. So if you look at this one, this is the over-the-shoulder shot of the man on the left and that female on the right. But I've made a silhouette, right? So now you can see the negative space or the negative shapes around the figures. Now look at if you cut to that, it's a very different shape, you see? This one, the man is still on the left, but his entire head is in the frame. The previous shot, his head was being cropped. This makes for a very different composition. So the graphic shapes are going to cut better, you see? So you don't want them to be too similar. So this is what I see a lot of times in more of the students or the junior story artists. They're just not paying close attention to those shapes, okay? So now I have the man, he's on the left still, and the female's on the right. Both their heads are about the same size, isn't it? Right? They're both in the frame. And then on the cut, when we cut to the man's face, you see, again, the shapes are too similar. The compositions are too similar. See the space around the man's head and around the female's head? The spacing is too similar. The shapes are too similar. So that doesn't cut well. That kind of warps and pops a little bit. All right? This one, there's greater shape change. See, the shape is greater. Better variety, better design, okay? Okay, now we're moving in. So we were over the shoulder. We could see the female's face. Now we move in. So we're closer to the subject. Now we have a close-up. Okay, she's kind of being cropped at the forehead. We're getting closer to her. This is a don't, okay? Don't, again, be aware of those tangents. Don't put her chin on the bottom of the frame and the head sandwiched between the frame. Okay, it's just going to be very uncomfortable, very awkward. This one has a little more space. Feels more comfortable, right? When you cut to a close-up, you're getting a lot more subtlety in the facial expressions of the character. You can feel what they're feeling a little better than when you're further away. This is a down shot. So again, we can cut up, we can cut down, we can cut flat. You always have that option. Where is the camera pointing? From what point of view, right? So this is the down shot. Again, it's still a close-up. We're still cropping off part of her head, but we're looking down. And then the following shot, you could change it to an up angle. Her point of view, she's looking up at, let's say, the man, and he's looking down on the female. So that's called an up and down relationship. Okay, so sometimes you want a certain character to feel more dominant, so you might shoot looking up at that character. And then if that character is dominating another character, then they will be looking down. Okay, they call it the up and down relationship. But these are just different options, right? Not one is necessarily better than another. It depends on your sequence. It depends on the context of your sequence. And then you'll make a decision, which is the best. Okay, now here's something where it's flat, right? You're not looking up, you're not looking down, you're looking flat at the wall. It's got no perspective at all. But if I look directly at him and he's placed in the center, and then I do a cut like that, I call that a match cut, because the shapes are similar. The eyes are dead center. Now, this also might be used for a purpose. If this guy is seeing this girl for the first time and he's attracted to her, and then she's attracted to him, we're locking the eyes, you see? The eyes are literally in the same place. Okay? So this technique might be used for your own benefit. Most of the time, you won't see that, right? You'll put the man slightly to one side on the left and the woman on the right, and that way there's a bias when we cut back and forth. But this might be for an effect. You might decide to put the two heads on top of each other. See that? Okay, this is now getting even closer. So now we're looking at just an extreme close-up of maybe the character's eyes. This is like a spaghetti western or something, where you're getting in close. If you're getting into that extreme close-up, you're really getting into the mind and the thinking process. Before, you were getting more emotion out of the face and the acting, the subtlety. But now, when you really get into the eyes that close, you're really getting into the head, into the thinking process of what the character's thinking. Okay? This is another example of an extreme close-up. So something that a character says or does, then you might cut to his fist. He's making a fist. Again, it's a close-up. You're making a point to make sure the audience sees that, and it's close, right? So it's something intimate between the audience and the character. I mentioned this before in the first lesson. Don't be afraid to think about, again, the feet, right? Characters can enter the frame, and you can just point the camera at the floor, and in comes the characters. We looked at it in the last lesson with the tea party, right? We sometimes can just focus on the lower part of the character, right? They could be having a conversation, and you can carry it on the feet, right? Just another option, but that's a close-up. Sometimes you see a character walking or entering the scene with their boots first. Again, it could be a way to introduce a character. So don't forget that's an option that you want to think about when you're thumbnailing. All right. This is called a pickup shot for obvious reasons, but it's also, you can cut away to the keys and to some table somewhere. It's a close-up on the keys, on some kind of little table with a lamp, and in comes the guy's hand, and he picks up the keys and exits, right? So he's picking something up. Characters, sometimes they drop the flashlight, they drop the keys. cut to the ground or cut to the table, and somebody's picking those things up. Okay, so it's a close-up. It's a little detail that you want the audience to see. Ooh, what's this? This one I can't tell what it is, but that's on purpose, okay? When you cut to something that's so flat, you don't know where you are. It's just the opposite of a wide establishing shot or an extreme wide establishing shot. You cut to some kind of flat thing with some texture, and you don't know what it is, but that's on purpose, okay? We call that an ambiguous shot. It's ambiguous. You don't know what it is. You're not supposed to know what it is, okay? So a shot like this would start with something that the audience is completely unaware of where they are, and then the hands come in and you see this little metal, and then you pull out. So what follows the ambiguous shot is usually a much wider shot that then explains where you were. So that close-up shot was basically the this little Billy Pip here. He's wearing sort of this raincoat, and then the captain's hand comes in and pins a medal on it. And then when we pull out, we'll see Billy looking at his medal on his raincoat. And he gives a little salute, and the captain returns a salute. Okay, so that's an ambiguous shot. Now, the other thing I want to mention in this kind of ambiguous shot, if you have an incredibly dramatic action shot, right, where there's fighting or there's chase scenes, there's a lot of camera, it's very busy. You know, that's like going to a rock concert and you're just listening to loud music for 2 or 3 songs in a row. Whew, it tires the audience out. So you need to kind of clean your palette visually. You need to quiet it down. So you have to pay attention to contrast in your storytelling. So this is a great transition. You go from something that's just a crazy chase scene, action, then you just cut away to something like this, and it's like, take a breath. Let's take the audience back down. And then we're transitioning to some kind of new place, new sequence, time cut sometime later. So that's a very good transition. It's a very good shot to have in your little toolbox. Don't forget that one. Okay. Next subject. After the shot selection, we're going to go into how a character might enter or exit the frame. This could be the first time a character has been introduced. It could be just another sequence and the character's just entering the environment, or it could be the end of a sequence and the characters are exiting the frame. These are just the basics, okay? Wow, look at that. So many ways. Most times when a junior story artist or a student, they just kind of have the character walk in, like this. There's the scene, and all of a sudden they just have the character walk in from the side. You can do that. There's no law against that. It's just not going to be that exciting. But be aware of every place in that frame that a character could enter or exit. So coming in from the side on the left, but it's flat because he's walking in. Again, he's walking in and he's parallel to the actual, like if the frame had a glass, if he's walking parallel to the frame, it's considered the action is flat. If the character is walking in or away from the frame on a diagonal or just coming in or away from the camera on that z-axis, it's going to be a little more dramatic. So keep that in mind when you're having the character enter or exit a frame, okay? So this is what I mean. If this pig comes in from the corners or from the left, but he's coming in as a big shape, and then he walks into the frame getting smaller, it's a little more dramatic because of the diagonal, okay? He can come in from the right. He can come in from the middle. He can come in from the bottom, right? He can come in from the top, okay? So he could be up in the tree, and he comes down, he swings, he lands. He's entered the frame. But somewhere in the middle, from the right middle, left middle, from the center, if there's anything like he could climb out of a hole like Bugs Bunny, but he's entering the shot from the middle or if he's coming from one of the sides, at the top or the bottom. So many ways. A lot of people don't think about that. They only have one or two, and they just keep repeating the same ways the character's entering or exiting the frame. Speaking of exiting, sometimes you'll have a character in the shot, and in comes the water buffalo walking through the frame, and the character disappears, right? So a character can vanish. We see that a lot if it's a spy thriller type of movie, Mission Impossible or something, or even if a horror movie like Halloween. You'll see a bus go by and she looks again and he's gone. So the bus is sort of a transition. It allows the character to vanish from wherever they were in the center. Okay? So entering and exiting a frame, again, it's a great way to reveal information. How do you reveal information? Entering a frame or exiting a frame. Don't forget about all those angles. Okay, shot combination. So this is another entering and exiting a frame, but in a wider shot. But we're going to go from different size shots in one shot. An example. This is an empty frame, just like the ambiguous frame where there's no real subject. This one, the subject is an empty frame. There's no characters necessarily, but it's just a village or it's just, some town. And there's not really a particular subject other than this is the town, right? Maybe there's little people sitting, doing things around, but none of that is just background setting. So this we call an empty frame. As soon as the character enters the frame, see, they're coming from the middle. They're coming from around a building, and they're small. The size of the subject relative to the frame. As they turn the corner, they run at the camera. Now they're going to obviously start growing to the full. As they exit, you're going to see these giant feet and boots come through the frame. So that's how they came in small and they left big, right? As they come running towards the camera, they exit. Okay? So that could be starting from an empty frame and have the characters running at camera, rapidly getting bigger, or they could reverse that and they could start big and enter and exit, through the middle of the frame like that. Just another option for you. Timing and spacing, when we talked about animation principles, let's talk about when characters are moving through the frame. This is a very specific detail, right? When you're first learning storyboarding, a lot of times people will just have an empty frame and they'll just have a character pop, and then they pop out. In your mind, you think, well, the animator is going to have him walk through. But it actually, when you're looking at the boards in an animatic where it's timed, you can't just do it sometimes with one. It'll just pop. So here's some examples of how to space and time so you understand that principle as it's used in animation and storyboarding. So if a character is coming through the frame slowly, then the rule is you're going to have more poses. If you have more poses, it's going to take longer to get the character through the frame. They're traveling slower. So this is I'm sort of working out the spacing and the timing. Timing refers to how long I'm going to be on that shot. Okay, so if I'm on a shot and it's an empty shot and the character is going to enter the shot, walk all the way through and exit, then there'll be a timing. If it's going to be 1 second or 2 seconds or 3 seconds, that's the timing it took the character to enter the shot and exit the shot, okay, or between the cuts. That's how long the duration is, the time. Spacing is where you place your key poses, okay? You can space them very evenly, or in this case, the character comes in sort of sneaking. He's kind of nervous. He looks around. He hears something, and then he darts. So you notice there's a gap between the third panel, the third pose, and when he's actually exiting the frame, and you can just see his ears and his one hoof. He's leaving. He's exiting. So that's what I mean by spacing. In animation, where are the poses going to be placed, okay, in that timing? So here's your empty frame. Let's watch it one time. From the empty frame, the character comes in, sneaking, looking around. He hears something, and he darts. He's out. Okay? So when you're doing your boards, you will be planning and carefully plotting where is the character placed in the frame, okay? Because it depends on how fast they're moving through the frame and what the performance is, whether you need 2, 3, 4, 5 poses. Okay, let's take a look at another example. If a character's running, they're moving faster. I can do that with 3, and I have it evenly spaced, right? The pig comes in, entering on the left. There's sort of one placed in the middle, and then you just see the feet coming out. And that's something you learn, like when you're sort of animating and storyboarding. You'll understand what the character will look like, the shape, the composition. So I know exactly how much of the pig I need to have coming in. You can see even part of his paw is on the other side of that plant. So again, that's composition, right? I know exactly where to put that character in each keyframe. And the very first lesson we were working on is again, getting a strong pose, getting a strong key pose. Now, as we start storyboarding and building an animatic, you're going to be aware of where the poses are so they can be timed and they can be spaced correctly. So running is going to be quicker. So when we cut to the empty frame here, watch. He comes in, middle, out. See? In 3 shots, he crosses that distance faster, right? Only took 3, see? 1, 2, 3, and he's gone. Okay? Because he's running. Now, if the pig, for some reason, is on a rocket and he's traveling like, Roadrunner, watch what happens now. I have a couple of vines in the foreground. Nothing's in the frame. It's empty. And then, whoosh! And then some leaves settle. So I'm doing it in 2, right? We went from 4 or 5 to 3 to 2. Let's see that again. Again, I'm now using the foreground element, which is the vines, to show movement. You see? There's really no movement at all, but when I draw it, the way I draw it, I can communicate movement in the design. Okay? So when he rockets, there's smoke, there's action lines, there's some leaves, there's dust. He is whooshing by, and look at the shapes of the vines. They're being affected by his movement. So fast. Then I still want the vines to return, but I want to have just, again, the dust is settling, and the leaves will settle. Okay, so I need those 2 key poses, right? Those 2 key frames to get him to just rocket through. Fewer of those poses is going to be faster action. Okay. In the camera, we're going to be talking about camera movement. We're going to be talking about that 180 rule, okay? Talked about it a little bit. We have to look at it a little bit closer, okay? The 180, what that means. We'll be talking about cutting, how to transitions in editing. There's techniques like whip panning, dissolving. Any of those transitions between shots or between sequences, we'll go over some of those. Space, we talked a little bit about that. If something is staged flat, deep, and then limited. Limited is somewhere between a flat and a deep. Okay, so we'll look at some of those examples. And then the camera moves that we have to work with. A storyboard artist doesn't have to be completely held down by these camera moves. You will want to indicate if something is panning, and we'll talk about the difference between panning or tilting, where the camera is really just pivoting, you see? It doesn't really move. It stays in place and it pivots. But when the camera is actually tracking or trucking, where it's pushing in with the action, the effect is a little different. It's going to be much more important in live action and when we're doing layout and CGI, right? Then you're really going to physically be moving a camera. You'll be talking about lenses. For a storyboard artist, I'm just going to introduce a few of those basic camera moves, and you can indicate that in the boards, okay? So panning, tilting, and zooming, those are things that are done when the camera is stationary. It can pivot, tilt, and the lens can zoom, but it's all happening in the same place. When you physically move the camera to follow an action, right, that's very different. These are trucking, tracking, dolly, crane, or some kind of handheld, okay? Some kind of handheld action where the cameraman is literally running with the camera or he's got some kind of handheld shaky cam device. Storyboard artists can be aware of those different camera movements to create a different emotion or different mood. But again, we won't necessarily work out all that stuff, in the production, right? That'll usually be done later in the production with the actual set and the animators. Okay, so first let's talk about continuity a little bit. If you look at the character, I've drawn it in yellow, there's an arrow because he's not looking directly at camera, he's not looking directly down, he's slightly to the left and he's looking slightly down to the right. So if he looks at his hands, for example, his gloves, okay, that's going to be a little awkward, you see, because of the way he's looking, right? If he's looking down and then we cut to the hands, actually we've crossed the 180. It's a very basic mistake that a lot of people will make. If you look at it again, he's looking slightly down. Now that feels better, you see, the way he's looking down at his hands, because I'm looking down and I expect my hands to be this way. I don't expect to look that way. And it has to do with the initial shot because the way he's looking. He's slightly left, looking down to the right. So this is going to feel more natural because you've got the continuity correct. Okay, this is a POV. He's looking down at his hands, and that's what he'll see. Okay, so let's talk about that 180 rule. I've drawn sort of a set, right? It's got a background, it's got a stage, and there's a man on the left, and there's a female on the right, and they're facing each other. So if I put an imaginary line between the two characters, and I keep the camera on this side where the audience is, for example, I can put the camera high looking down, I can look flat in the middle, I can look low up. As long as I keep the camera on the one side where the audience is, I'll never have a problem with continuity. So that's a rule. Okay, so let's take a look at that. All right, so the man is clearly on the left and the female is on the right. I've drawn in red the 180 line between them. So the camera is still on the man's right side and it's going to go over all the way to the woman's left side. We're staying on that one side where the audience is, okay? On the reverse, again, the camera's still staying on that one side where the audience is, okay? But the woman stays on the right, the man stays on the left. When we get to the close-ups, the man is slightly to the left, looking right, and the female is biased or slightly on the right, and she's looking left at the man. So if you cut to a two-shot and it's wider and they're coming together to hug, again, you expect that she's going to be on the right and he's going to be on the left, you see? That's the standard basic rule, okay? Now let's look again. Again, if someone's not paying attention, the man will be on the left, the female on the right. We cut to the reverse. The man is on the left and she's still on the right. He's looking from the left to the right. She's now looking from the right to the left. Everything's good. And then you cut to this shot where they run to each other to hug. It's jarring, right? It's like, wait a minute. I thought your brain is going to read a series of shots and it's going to try to figure out where they are in relationship to where we are. They call that geography. So if you cross the 180 like this where you make a mistake, it's going to create a jarring effect, okay? So first, follow the rules, learn the rules of the 180, and then later if you decide to break the rules, I'll let you know when that is. There are examples where you will want to break the 180. So this 180 rule, it's worth looking at and it's worth experimenting with because there are so many different techniques that will allow us to work around that 180 because sometimes you may need to cut from a front and cut to a back. Okay, we might need to cross. And there's several little techniques that you should be aware of. Okay. So obviously, if you're looking at the first image on the left, it's a man sitting at a table in a library somewhere. Now the next shot is the reverse shot. you're looking at the back of the man sitting at the table in the library. But if you look at the size of the shot, remember that if you look at the subject relative to the frame, they're about the same size, right? The character sitting at the desk is about the same size relative to the frame. The composition, the shape, is about the same. So this would be a jarring cut, okay? Let's take a look. Here's the front view, and if you were to cut to the back view, you see how these two compositions are very similar. You see that? It's very jarring. Okay. Now, there are different techniques. So one of the techniques is to use your shot selection. So simply changing the size of the shot from the front shot, which is wide, and then cutting to the back shot, which is a close. Okay? Varying or changing the size of the shot from front to back is going to soften the cut. Okay, let's take a look. Front view of the man in the library, and then cut to the back view. It's still jarring, but the shape is so different. You're not cutting from one composition that is too similar to the other composition. See? Wide, close. The shapes are very different, and that's a technique that will help you soften that kind of cut. All right, now, number 2, we have the camera angle. So if you look at the one on the left, it is a wide shot, but now we're looking down on the subject. We're looking down at the library. We can see the floor. And then we cut to maybe a slight upward angle, so down and up. The shape changes, the composition changes, the angle changes, okay? So that's the second technique. Let's take a look. We're looking down on the guy at the table in the library, and then the back view. Totally different composition, different angle. See, looking down, looking up. Okay? Number 3, we can move the camera. It's another option, right? So if you look at there's a map here that I've given you where the camera is at a start position in front, and then the camera just moves. It's perfectly fine to cross the 180 if the camera, in a continuous, without cutting, the camera just moves around. You can do that all day long. It's fine. You're not breaking any rules. So let's take a look at that. This is like, again, a dolly shot or handheld shot where the camera just walks around the subject. We can see him from the front in the library, and then you simply move the camera around to the side, all the way around to the back. See? This is not with cutting, but we will actually see a camera move all the way around. So the camera can cross the 180. The audience will never be confused. The geography is very clear. So moving the camera, remember that. It's a good technique. Number 4, to cut around. Now, this is different. You are editing, you are cutting. So we're going from the wide front shot and then cutting around to the side on a close-up of the hand, turning the pages of the book he's reading, and then we get to the back. So we're changing the shape, we're cutting away to something, but in this case, the camera, sometimes they call that step. You step from the front, step to the side. Last time we moved the camera in one continuous shot, but you can also step it by cutting around. Take a look. You're in your wide front shot, cutting on the hand, turning the page. We're on the side of the subject, and then we cut to the back. It's a way of softening to cross the 180 in steps like that, okay? We can move the subject. So this is a little different, but again, it's letting you think about the different ways we're using either the camera or moving the character itself, or we can, again, use different size shots and different angles. So this is another technique. Number 5, we're going to move the subject. You can see in my map, the character is going to be sitting down in one place, get up, walk around the table, and sit down. So the character is actually moving. So if you look at the front composition, the character is just going to stand up. As he's reading, he walks around to the other side of the table, pulls up a stool, and sits down. So we haven't actually cut from front to back, But what we did is we had an option where the character got up and walked around. We just stayed in the camera stays in the same spot, but we can move the character, okay? Number 6, this is a cutaway. It's like before we were cutting in on the side shot of the man turning the pages. This is very similar, but you can cut away to some other place in the room, okay? So here we have the man in the front shot, and you can see in that wider shot, you can see there is a clock on the wall, and you might cut in. Just to cut away, you're inserting a shot between the front and the back. Let's take a look. There's the wide establishing shot from the front. Cut to the clock on the wall. Sometimes you can do a dissolve here where you're going to show the hands have changed. We do a time cut. You can do a transition like that on this cutaway. And then it's later, and now the camera is in the back position. We've cut away from the front to the clock to the back. Okay, so that's a technique. Number 7, to cut on action. So earlier, we saw that the character started to stand up. He was moving. So his action of standing up, and he walked around the table and sat down. Now, instead of watching the character do that entire movement, we can cut on that character's action. So if you look at the front shot, the character starts to move. The character starts to take an action of standing up, and then we cut to him on the other side sitting down. It's a little different technique. You are editing, you are cutting, but you're going to soften the effect of the cut or the edit by adding the character's movement or the character's action. So let's take a look. The character's sitting at the desk, they start to stand up, and then we cut to the back, and the character's now sitting down. That action of standing up and sitting down, that movement will soften the effect of that hard cut from front to back. That's a technique, cutting on action. Okay, so this one now, similar, but now we're using the camera. We're going to move the camera in on the wide shot. We're going to see or feel the camera slowly pushing in, and then on the cut to the back, the camera is continuing to move in. So there's some continuity in the camera movement. The camera is pushing in. We still edit. We still cross the 180. You're going to feel a little jar, but the movement of the camera will soften the effect of that jarring cut to crossing the 180. Let's take a look. So we're going to push in on the character, and then we cut to the back and continue to push in. You see that? So that movement, see? That movement of pushing in is going to soften the effect of the cut. So you can cut on movement of the camera, or you can cut on the action of the character moving. 2 techniques. Okay. Now, when I was teaching my storyboard artists these techniques, I was putting this together, these notes, and I remember talking to my son Clay, and I said, hey Clay, I got this little test I'm going to give the story artist. I said, and he was in high school or middle school, and he was taking some kind of film class, right, in high school. So I explained to him exactly what I just explained to you. I said, Clay, I got this character here in the wide shot from the front, and then I'm going to cut to the back shot, which is very jarring. And I'm going to ask the storyboard artist to come up with different ways to make that transition better, smoother, less jarring. And so my son's funny. He goes, Dad, that's what he talks. Dad, sometimes the director wants a jarring effect for the story. And I'm like, okay. Yes, Clay, that's true, right? That is true. It's funny because he skipped all the other techniques and he just went right for the jugular, right? He went right for the throat. He said, Dad, sometimes the director wants the effect. So we did this little exercise which pointed out several techniques to use the camera, to use the subject, to cut around, or different ways to cross the 180. But there are times in the story that you'll want a jarring effect. You'll want the audience to notice something. You know, you're making a point about something. If it's a horror movie, then maybe you want to scare somebody. Okay, so yes, obviously there are times when you'll want to cut to a shot like this, and you're maybe there's a little bit of pushing in, but you're going from the front and you cut. And that kind of cut is very jarring because of the tangent, right? I mean, because it's the same shape, same composition, but you're going front to back. But it does create an effect. And maybe that's the effect that the filmmaker or storyteller wants, okay? So be aware of the rules, and then when you decide to break the rules, you better have a good reason. It should have an effect on the storytelling. It will have an effect on the storytelling, okay? So here's another example. That's one example, okay, that we might actually want that jarring effect. Here's another one that you see a lot of times in a romantic film. Here we have that over-the-shoulder shot we saw earlier. The man's on the left and the female's on the right. And as they come together, the camera can push in or she walks up, and we get closer and closer as they finally kiss, right? We're kind of close on the kiss. Notice where the female's still on the right and the man is on the left. And then, it cuts. See that? It cuts. The man has switched. So on the kiss is when you cut you break the 180. You see that? Let's watch that again. The female comes forward. She's on the right. They come in, they embrace, they kiss, and then bam. On the kiss, they switch positions. Okay? So earlier I told you what the basic rule was, but in a romantic comedy, if you want your kiss to have more punch, then think about how to break that rule. And it's done all the time. You won't even notice it, but people that are watching it will feel it. They won't even know. They're not aware that the filmmaker is manipulating them, okay, by creating that jarring effect, okay? It just makes the kiss more important, more magical, okay? So sometimes we do want to break the rules. First, learn the rules. All right. What else we got? Panning, pivoting, where the camera remains, if the camera remains in place and it's just pivoting, let's take a look at what that looks like, okay, in sort of an action scene or scary scene. I have a little map. This is my little geography map. You can see where the girl is running around this hall, and then she's going to run into the bad guy, some kind of monster or whatever. Okay, but look at where the camera is not moving with her. The camera is just looking in one direction and follows the action. Okay, it just follows the girl running by. Now let's take a look at the boards. So this is an empty frame down the hall. Here comes the character, right? She's running towards the camera, looking back. She thinks the killer's behind her. She's running. It gets to this flat position right in front of the camera. And then as it tilts the other way, it's a reveal. You see that? So that's what I mean by it's a flat movement, even though there's perspective here. The camera movement is actually flatter because it just follows there, see? And then you reveal the character. And this is done all the time, like in a horror movie or something. Revealing the character. Tracking is different. Tracking, the camera is moving with the subject. And you'll get what's called a parallax, where the background, middle ground, and foreground are actually crisscrossing. They're crossing each other. And it creates a very different effect. Okay, take a look at the tracking shot. I got a map, so you can see the pillars, you can see the space. Usually when I'm thumbnailing, I always draw something like this so the director knows exactly where everything is. Okay? So you can see she's walking between the pillars, and the camera is following her. So let's take a look at what that looks like. There's the pillars, very large room. She's very small. She's just looking at the paintings, walking. But watch the pillars in the background and the pillar in the foreground. See, they're crisscrossing. See that? See that? You can really feel the three-dimensional space. Whenever you're tracking with the character, that parallax will really create a more three-dimensional, deeper space, okay? Big columns or big shapes in the foreground, smaller shapes in the background, but you're actually seeing more movement. There's more movement there. Even though in the last shot she was running a long ways, actually it's not nearly as dramatic as this. See when when those pillars start to move, see? You can feel the space, even in a storyboard. Okay, so we have tilting. Again, just like the pan was a pivot horizontally, the tilt is a pivot up. So let's see how we could use that. This is sort of a high dive, stand on a stage, and the camera is going to tilt up and reveal the diver. You see that? We start at the bottom, the camera tilts. This is kind of a whip pan when you see these blurry lines because you're moving the camera very quick, see? But the camera stays on the ground and it just tilts up to reveal the information, okay? That's a tilt. A pull out or a zoom, right? This is just using the camera lens to sort of just pull out and zoom, might be in a situation like this, where I'm close on the pig here, and he's got a reaction. He goes, oh no, and then we find out why. You reveal by pulling out, there's this big, cluttered, dirty shack that he's supposed to clean, right? So that's a pull out. You're starting close, and the camera just, with a zoom, is just pulling back, see? That's pulling out like that. You could also go from here, and you can reverse it and push in, right? You can push in for an effect, for the reaction. Either way is fine, but just be aware of that zoom in, zoom out, pull in. It's a little different when the camera is pushing in because you'll see greater movement of the foreground, middle ground, and background. But for boards, this is fine. Pull out, reveal. Always think about how you're revealing information. How are you using the camera, or how are you using the movement of the action of the character to reveal information? Okay, continuity, we've talked a little bit about this. You're moving into one frame from another. So a lot of times we'll be doing an action or a series of actions, right, over a little sequence, and characters are moving out of one frame into the other frame and out of that frame into another frame. And the size of the shot will change. So I'm going to give you a little example of that. Back to the diving board ladder, right? So we cut on the stage, there's some kind of high dive ladder, and our professor is walking in, starts to climb. Now look he climbs out of that shot, right up and out of the shot, and then you see his hand in a closer shot. See, we've changed the size, but he's still the continuity of movement. He went up in the full shot, and then he's still moving up through the frame as he climbs the ladder in sort of this close-up. We can get a good shot of his face. And then we cut to a wider shot, okay, where he climbs up to the top of the platform, and he's ready to dive. Okay, let's take one last look at that one more time. Okay, we're in a wider shot here. It's empty. The character enters the frame from the side, climbs up the ladder into the next shot, which is a middle or close. See? And then into another wide shot. We're looking up now, though. The angle changed. And then he's ready to dive. He jumps. Watch how he exits this shot. He's entered, and then he exits. As he exits the bottom, then we can cut. Either he can enter this shot, or we can cut, and he's already in the middle of the frame. And we're tracking. So the camera is dropping with the character, okay? And then you see the background just racing by. So that's, again, we're entering and exiting another shot. And then he's going to pull this backpack, and out comes these big wings. So we cut wider so we have room for the rings. We can see more space. And then he's going to basically swoop before hitting the ground, and he entered and he exited. We have a little bit of dust settling. And then we pause, and then the whole background blurs, and there's a sound effect. Bang, bing, bang. And then some things off screen will fly in. So that's an impact. Instead of showing the impact, we could have him sail through the shot, impact off screen. Right? Then we can whip pan, and he's still stuck to the wall, and he slowly peels himself off and falls to the ground. Right? So that's just an example of continuity. It's very, very easy to follow the action again, if you're just aware of what direction is the character facing, what direction is the character moving in and out of the frame. And you can change the size, the shot selection does change, but the continuity, see, screen direction and his movement, he's coming in from the left, he climbs up out of that shot into a middle shot, out of that shot into a wide shot looking up, and then he jumps, he exits the shot, cuts to a new shot. He's still falling, so we'll see the background go. He pulls the wings, cut wide, swooping off screen, impact, blur, debris, settle, whip pan, reveal. He peels off and falls down for comic effect. Okay? And that's exactly when you're doing your boards. If you can board like that, the audience will always follow. So that's why you have to know the basic rules, just so your storytelling is clear. If you're too jarring with your cutting, or you're not paying attention to screen direction or the 180, boy, the audience is just having such a hard time following your story. So you got to learn those basic rules, those basic foundations, and you'll have a lot more success with your storytelling. The entertainment is so much easier when the audience can actually follow the action. Especially for comedy. That's why we shoot everything, flat. Easy to follow. Okay, so trucking and crane, using the crane. The camera, again, is following the character. So this is a crane shot and a combination trucking and crane. So I've done a diagram. The character's walking to the camera. The camera's, someone could be hand holding it, or it could be on a crane, and it's just following the character back. Then it goes up over. It's going to do a little twist so it can come around from behind. So it's going like this, and then it twists, and then it follows from behind. All in one shot. They call that a craning shot. So this is a middle shot. The camera's pulling back as the character's walking. Now notice it starts to lift up over him, looking down, straight down, and then there's going to be a twist as the camera moves around, and now it's coming down from behind. See? And that's the end, right? Okay, so that's our basic cinematography, the different shots, the different camera, some of the rules, some of the basic foundation. And I have one more thing to show you before we go. To cut or not to cut. So this is one example. I know a lot of times people will ask, they'll ask all kinds of questions. They'll say, well, how many cuts do you need? When you're doing a sequence, how many shots do you need? How long should the sequence be? These questions are almost irrelevant because depending on the subject, right, and what you want to say with it, okay? So this is an example where sometimes people will think that you always have to have this cutting rhythm where it's like the shot is on screen, 1, 2, cut, 1, 2, and everything's kind of very cutty. And you don't always want to do that, okay? Sometimes you want to start a sequence without cuts. You will simply allow the camera to follow the action. Very good for geography because the audience will always know where they are without those cuts, okay? And then you can be on a subject longer without the cuts, and then later in the sequence, if you want to build up drama or contrast, this is where you start to cut and introduce more interesting shots, or just more shots that are different compositions. Every time you cut from one place to another, the audience will always have to acclimate. Okay, that's why the continuity, screen direction, and the 180 is so important, because you want to make it easier for the audience to follow your film or follow your story. Okay, so that's why you got to learn these rules. This was a very simple exercise I used to give the story artists, where it's the same subject, but it's being shot 2 different ways. And that's another good way to learn. You give the same subject or the same story, and then find different ways of using the camera or using the shot selection, and you're creating a different effect. It'll create a different emotion. It's going to create a different story. So let's take a look. I call it cut or not to cut. So this is, again, your decision making as a filmmaker When you're storyboarding, that's what a storyboard artist is doing. It's visually telling the story. You're going to provide the production or the director, again, a series of shots, a series of pictures that are telling a story for the director. Okay, so let's take a look at the same action. I have the basic story beats written down, okay? So we know exactly what we're going to draw or what we're trying to, the story we're trying to tell. So here's the story. We're going to reveal a female character. She's returning home from work. As the woman walks down a hall in an apartment complex, she comes to her door, and she's going to retrieve her keys from her purse or something, and she accidentally drops her keys. It's been a long day. Then she's going to bend down and retrieve the keys, right? Get it in the keys in the door, and just enter her apartment and close the door. So this is not a long sequence. It's just a short little story. It's a short little scene. Okay, so that's the story that we're trying to tell. Okay, this is sort of an empty shot. We're looking down the hallway of some kind of apartment complex, and the character enters the frame from the middle. See, she comes around the corner. The camera's going to pull. We follow her. She gets closer and closer to the camera. She's getting the keys out of the purse. She goes to put the keys in the door, and she drops the keys. She bends down. She retrieves the keys. The camera follows her all the way up. She puts the keys in the door, turns the keys, and goes in, shuts the door. Okay? Everything was done in one shot. Okay? Now let's take a look at another approach. Right? This one's going to be different. Same story, but it's going to be told differently. Let's look again. Empty hall. The character's revealed. Then we cut close. We pan up the figure. Then we cut to this shot. She gets the keys. She drops the keys. Cut to the feet. Cut to the ground. The hand comes in, retrieves the keys. Cut above. And she stands up, puts the keys in the door, and she enters the apartment. Okay? It is the same story, but it's not being told the same way. You see, there's different techniques. Not one is right and not one is wrong. Let's take another closer look. Okay. In the first example, notice the size of the character, right? It's a fairly wide shot. She's small. She enters the frame. The camera's pulling, but she's going to continue to travel faster than the camera. So that's going to change the shot selection. But it's in one shot without any cutting, you see? Now she's getting larger. Now she's in the middle. She gets the keys. We push even closer. So it's all in one camera move. She drops the keys. When she bends down, the camera goes with her, see, to the floor. She retrieves her keys. The camera goes up with her. She puts the key in the door, and she enters her apartment and shuts the door, okay? So we did have different size shots. We didn't have any problem with cutting. We didn't have any problem following the story. And we may not want that extra contrast of cutting, right? It's just kind of like there's a lot less contrast. She just walks in and everything plays out in one shot. Nice, easy. The second option, it does create a little more drama, a little more contrast, okay? The empty shot, when she walks in, she's still in a wide, and then we cut in, okay? So if you're going to reveal a character like this female and you want to say something, by cutting in closer, you're getting the audience more intimate. So now we can really study her costume, her figure, all the way up, and then we can get a very close-up shot of her face, okay? So that's cutting in and then using a camera move to sort of pan or tilt up, right, the figure. Now, there's a little contrast there, right, because it bumps out. We're pushing in and it bumps out. You're going to feel a little bit of a jarring effect. It has more contrast. Then she turns to put the keys in. Camera's pushing in. That could be a push in or that could be a cut. You'll see that a lot. If they want to keep building up contrast, they're going to do those little cuts. It creates a rhythm, right? A cutting rhythm. She drops the keys. Now it just cuts to the feet. See? That's different than then bringing the character down to the keys. You cut to the feet, the hand comes in, entering the shot, picking up the keys. Now we cut continuity, right? So you're doing it with her action, see? Her hand goes down, grabs the keys, the hand starts to come up, and then she continues. We just saw that in the last example, when you're getting a subject in and out of a frame. She puts the key in, turns the key, goes into her apartment, and slams the door, okay? So not one is right or wrong. It depends on the context of your sequence. It depends on what is the context of that sequence in the overall, whatever, your story, whether or not you choose to have cutting, or whether or not you choose to use camera and not cutting, okay? These are just the basics. Learn the basics, and then when you get your own sequence, you can then start to make decisions, okay? You'll make better decisions. Okay, so that's the end of lesson 4, cinematography. We'll see you back at the drawing board for the next lesson.